Good morning and welcome, everyone, to the Salt Lake City Planning Division's Affordable Housing Overlay Facebook Live event. I'm Nick Norris, the Planning Director for Salt Lake City. Joining me today is Sara Javoronok, Project Manager for the Overlay, and several of our planning staff, John Anderson and Chrissy Gilmore, who are working on this project and will help us answer questions as they come in. After we do a presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. But let's start by giving an overview of what this project is. The Affordable Housing Overlay is a tool that is proposed to be added to the zoning code that incentivizes the building or preserving of affordable housing. The goal of the overlay is to do two things. First, to help tax dollars and private dollars that go into building affordable projects create more housing units. The proposal includes the use of density bonuses, shortening approval timelines, and modifying some zoning regulations to ensure that that can happen. Second, the incentives may open the door for property owners to start thinking about how their property may be used to provide new affordable housing units. In many zoning districts, zoning rules currently prohibit some property owners from investing in their property to build more housing. A key component of this project will be defining what affordability means. The incentives are tied to a definition of affordability, with a greater incentive for those homes that are affordable to those with the lowest incomes. Any property that uses the incentives would be deed restricted for a certain number of years to ensure the homes subject to the incentives remain at an affordable level. Fines will be used to guarantee that that if a unit is not maintained at the agreed upon level, that the financial penalty would be equal to the difference in the charge rate versus the agreed upon rate. Sara will provide more information on the various options and details of the proposal that are currently included in the overlay and that we are seeking your comments on. I'll now turn the time over to Sara.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to outline the different parts of the Affordable Housing Overlay proposal. First, I'll talk about how it would apply to multifamily and mixed-use zoning districts, and then how it would apply to single and middle family zoning districts. I'll also describe the proposed process modifications to standards that could be applied, and then the next steps for the proposed changes. First, for multifamily and mixed-use zones, the proposal for zoning districts that allow multifamily housing and also a mix of uses is generally for additional height ranging from 1 to 3 stories. A single story is recommended in zones that are generally adjacent to other less intensive zones. An additional height is recommended in areas that allow for greater height, like the downtown zoning districts. This would be permitted by right in some areas, and in others where design review is required, there would be an administrative design review process. This would require the proposal to meet the same design standards unless modifications could be approved through the process, but it would not require the early engagement or public hearing process. The intent here is to make the process simpler and likely faster. However, there would be less opportunity for public comments and fewer notifications of projects. Additionally, we want to allow some housing types like single family attached, which would be in addition to multifamily housing in the corridor commercial zone, which is scattered around the city with concentrations along State Street and Redwood Road, and also the general commercial zone, which is located along 300 West and I-15 and other areas in the city. An existing standard that we're looking to modify is in the transit station area zoning district. It allows for an additional story if the proposal meets the required points for administrative review. The proposal is to require affordable housing to obtain this extra story. Some TSA zones, like those along North Temple, have a number of proposals with affordable units. However, others, like along 400 South, are generally market rate units. And this would provide an incentive for developers to include affordable units in all of the TSA zones. This would incentivize the construction of affordable housing in areas close to services, employment, and transit. This part of the proposal includes the single and 2-family zoning districts and the RMF or residential multifamily districts. The single and 2-family districts include much of Rose Park, Poplar Grove, the Avenues, Liberty Wells, and the East Bench. The proposal would apply to areas of these zoning districts that are adjacent to arterial roads or within 1/4 mile of high-frequency transit, and this includes bus or rail routes. And in these areas, additional housing types would be allowed, including single-family attached, 3 and 4 dwelling units. This is a modification from the initial proposal that would have permitted ADUs in 2-family homes by right if one of them was restricted as affordable housing. We removed this from the proposal because of the state law, which is now in effect, that permits attached ADUs, and also because of the staff resources that would likely be needed for a small number of units. We would include design standards for the additional building types and relatively minor modifications to the existing standards, including setbacks and lot coverage. So the buildings couldn't be taller or much larger than what is already permitted in the zoning district. This would likely result in units that are smaller and generally more affordable, plus half of them would be deed restricted as affordable units. The second half of this applies to the RMF zoning districts that have a mix of housing, generally middle housing that ranges from single-family homes to larger multifamily buildings. The proposal would require a percentage of the units to be deed restricted as affordable, and as long as that percentage was met, the current density requirements wouldn't apply. The building would still need to meet the requirements of the underlying zone, so the height and massing wouldn't differ significantly from what is currently permitted, but would have more and likely smaller and more affordable units. Similar to the administrative design review proposal, another aspect of the overlay is to simplify the process by not requiring a planned development in certain zones or circumstances when affordable housing is proposed. It would eliminate this requirement for development in the GMU and CS zoning districts, which include the Gateway, Brickyard, and a few other areas. It would remove this requirement for buildings that do not have street frontage as well. Many proposals go through the plan development process for this request, and this would not change building or fire code requirements, but it would likely decrease the processing time and eliminate the early notification and public hearing requirements. The final part of the proposal is that it would allow for relatively small modifications to the standards for single and middle housing zones. The intent is to allow for minor modifications to the setbacks and yards up to 25%, which is generally 1 or 2 feet, and remove the minimum lot width requirement and allow for greater building coverage, generally 10% more if it's compatible with the rest of the street. These minor modifications would allow for additional development in areas, but not a significantly greater amount of development than what is currently permitted or was permitted in the past. So this is unlikely to have a significant effect on the character of the area. As far as next steps, we have draft documents posted online for review. The website is posted on this slide, http://bit.ly/slc-aho. There's a brief 2-page summary, a version that has a document that describes a lot of what we just talked about in more detail. And then it also includes appendices with the draft zoning ordinance amendment text, and then also more information about the changes that were initially included in 2020. And the third document does not include these appendices. Please review these and provide comments in the form that is on the webpage. You can also let us know if you want us to present to your community council or other community group. Please write us with questions. My name is at the bottom of the webpage, and we're also reviewing the comments. And please provide contact information if you'd like a response back from a comment. Once we finish the outreach process, we'll review the feedback and we'll determine any modifications that need to be made. The proposal will likely be scheduled for a planning commission briefing where we'll outline it, and then the commission will have the opportunity to ask questions. There will be at least one hearing, although there will be the opportunity for public comment at a later date. And then following review and recommendation by the planning commission, the proposal will be sent to the city council for their review. They'll also hold a briefing and at least one hearing prior to making a decision. So we can now move on to the Q&A portion. Please post any questions that you have as comments, or you can also email planning.comments@slcgov.com. And so it looks like we already have a couple questions. The first is, will the final version of this proposal be informed by the Thriving in Place study that's now underway? And so at this point, the Thriving in Place study is assessing and analyzing gentrification and displacement in the city. It's in the early stages of this process, and interviews with community members and organizations are ongoing. And this proposal will be informed by that study, and we'll work together as the study progresses. So the second question that we have so far is what can be done to make sure that the overlay cannot be gamed by speculative Airbnb developments? Nick, do you want to go ahead and answer that one, or have me answer that?
Sure. I'd love to. So there's this proposal can include prohibitions on short-term rentals so that Airbnbs could not be utilized or operated on any of the properties that choose to utilize the incentives from this overlay. The other thing that is going to be helpful right now is that there are a couple of bills at the state legislature too that will make it easier for cities to enforce short-term rental regulations. So hopefully those bills pass and they help us be quicker and more able to enforce on short-term rentals, not just for those units that are subject here, but in other residential areas where short-term rentals are currently not allowed.
Thank you. So another question is, will there also be deeply affordable housing as a separate category? And right now we have identified a couple different levels of area median income that we would require as part of using these incentives. There's an 80% AMI for certain incentives and then a 60% AMI for certain incentives. We haven't necessarily identified incentives that would be at a kind of a deeper, more affordable level than that. That obviously doesn't preclude developers from providing those at those levels, but the incentive would be available to developments that are at that 60 or 80% or lower level. So we have one other question at this point. So will this housing be ADA and transit adjacent? So as some aspects of this proposal would apply to zoning districts that are within a quarter mile of transit, whether it's bus or rail, and other aspects of this incentive proposal would apply just more broadly to zoning districts. And so there would be some aspect of this that would be near transit. And then as far as ADA improvements, it would be what's required by the building code and does not specify additional ADA requirements beyond what is otherwise required by the code. So we do have one question from Stephen on Facebook. Is this going to be a mandate in certain zones or an incentive? And the proposal is for an incentive rather than a mandate. So this would be something that developers could opt into pursuing, but would not be required to pursue. Another example of options that other cities have used is inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing. And with inclusionary housing, it requires a certain percentage of housing units in a new development to be affordable. And this has worked in some communities, but it has had mixed results in others. The primary issue with inclusionary zoning is that it increases the costs of other units in a development to offset the loss of revenue from affordable units. And so the overlay could potentially offset that impact by providing additional units to increase revenue for the owner. And so that this is an incentive rather than a requirement. And so, and question from Jesse on Facebook, why are some historic neighborhoods excluded and others included? And generally what we're doing with the overlay is we're not necessarily looking at whether a neighborhood is historic or not. We're generally looking at the zoning district that applies in addition to that status. And there had been some questions with the initial proposal as to how many historic properties were potentially going to be affected. So we did identify whether there were historic properties within these areas, and then any historic overlay that is applicable, any development that takes place would have to follow the requirements of that overlay.
Yeah, Sarah, maybe I can add, one of the things that we really want to get some feedback on is, and I think this is something that the Thriving in Place study will help us identify as well, is that there are, when you try to align this overlay with, particularly with transit, it does leave some neighborhoods out, particularly in the east side of the city that don't have great or good transit access. And so one of the things that we are hoping to identify through this process are ways that those neighborhoods can be included in this as well. So we do believe that all neighborhoods should be participating or have this as an option applied to them. And so hopefully as this progresses, we start getting some feedback on what and how that can happen.
Thanks, Nick. Somewhat similar to this question from Kelly on Facebook. Will this be directed to the west side? And just to start off, Nick, if you want to add to this, generally what we were trying to do with this proposal is to include areas all over the city and to not necessarily have it be directed at one part of the city or the other. I'm really trying to look at the different zoning districts and how we can improve opportunities and add opportunities for housing in all of those zoning districts across the city.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And the other thing that we were very cognizant of is that more housing in neighborhoods of high opportunity improve everybody's access to opportunity. And so that's something that we really want to ensure that is embedded into this overlay so that we have those options, of people have those options more so than what they do right now.
There's another question from Megan on Facebook. Are taxpayers subsidizing rent?
So this overlay doesn't have any sort of additional financial price tag to it, but it would utilize existing tax funded programs that are out there, whether it's at the federal, state, or at the city level. And the idea behind that is, one, those programs are already in place, and two, if the zoning barriers that end up limiting the number of units that can be produced are removed, then it helps increase the number of units and those dollars hopefully can go further than what they have gone, further than they have in the past.
We have another question. This one's from Nigel on Facebook. Have you considered that increasing density on single family homes will further drive up prices, at least in the short term? And I'll go ahead and start off. Or Nick, you want to start off with this one then?
Please, Sarah, go for it.
I'll start and then I'll turn it over to you. So we have considered that one aspect of this proposal is that the potential units that we're allowing in these single family zoning districts or two family zoning districts would only be able to be used if half of the additional units that are being provided would be deed restricted as affordable housing. And so it would allow some additional density, but at the same time, it's also creating deed restricted affordable housing. And this should kind of help to mediate that potential impact. I have another question from Jesse. From reading the draft, I thought that neighborhoods on the local historic registry were excluded versus those with only national historic status were included. Is that incorrect? So there are a number of historic districts throughout the city. Many of them are on the locally designated, and then those that are locally designated are also on the National Register as well. So it applies to districts all across the city that are both locally and nationally designated. It's more reflective of the underlying zoning district that they're in, whether it's R15000 or SR1A, where it applies. And then as it's written right now, if they're closer to the high frequency transit routes as well. So there's a question from Megan. There's a density concern where we are living already. Less than 1 mile away, we are seeing 700 plus units being built at 21st and 21st. What is the city's plan with the increase in traffic?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we've been focused on where our transit is, and the city has been using other tools to help support density, such as investing in increased services along certain bus routes, using the funding our future dollars that were passed by voters a couple of years ago now. That's probably the single biggest thing. One of the reasons why we were looking at transit. I think we recognize that we're not going to be building more roads or wider roads through our neighborhoods. And so one of the things that our plans, our adopted community plans talk quite a bit about actually is growing in those places that are already or can be readily serviced by things like transit, that are close to grocery stores and parks and open space, so that some of the trips that people normally would take don't have to be taken by car. There's choices. We recognize that there will still be the majority of people choosing to use a vehicle, at least for some trips. And sometimes those trips are necessary. And so, but we want to create options for people. And that's why you'll see the city investing in transit, investing in various trails, such as the S line, the Jordan River Parkway, the Folsom Trail, Corridor Trail, the 9 line, but also in other areas too, as well, including creating and growing more mixed use centers where that are closer to where more people can live.
There's also a question from Susan: how long would the deed restrictions last? And as currently written, the proposal is for 30 years. This could be altered depending on what we hear as far as feedback through the process, but 30 years is what we're targeting at this point.
And it should be noted too that sometimes those funding sources that are tied to affordability have different periods of time where they have to be retained as affordable units. And sometimes those are as long as 50 years, sometimes they're longer. And it also depends on what entity is using those funds to build that housing. If it's a nonprofit affordable housing, sometimes those can be longer durations of time where they're preserved as affordable.
Another question from Megan is there data around how well used the transit is in these neighborhoods? And
yeah, we get that data from UTA, and we certainly can have our transportation division pull that data for us and make that available.
And then one thing to add is I think a number of routes have been added through the Funding Our Future in recent years. I think it might be a little bit tricky to calculate the usage on those routes compared to how it would have been pre-COVID or a few years ago. So I think we'd want to, when we evaluate those, also try to take those aspects into consideration too. So some other questions that we've heard earlier in the process is, why doesn't the city implement rent control? And Utah code prohibits rent control statewide. The city does not regulate the prices that individuals, private individuals and owners charge. And our zoning ordinance also doesn't address prices or ownership, and those decisions are left to the market. So I just wanted to add that as well. Another question is, why should residents really care about this?
So as the city has surveyed people from around the community, affordable housing and access to housing is the number one issue in almost every neighborhood in the city. And we know that right now the way we're growing is primarily through big apartment buildings. And while we need those apartment buildings to help accommodate that growth, because that helps believe it or not, slow down the rate of increase of rent and for sale properties. But we also recognize that we need more options for people. If we truly want to have a livable city, we need a variety of housing types, not just mostly single family homes or mostly apartments, which tend to be what we have right now. And so what this proposal is aimed at is finding ways to incentivize the other types of housing, like Sara said, those small apartment buildings, the duplexes and triplexes, the townhomes and things like that. But right now they're challenging to build because most of our land in the city is not zoned for residential. And so all of the residential property or all the residential needs are competing with the commercial properties. And as a result, not only is it resulting in bigger apartment buildings being the predominant new housing type that's being built, but we're also starting to see some of our commercial properties that are critical to neighborhoods be transitioned to housing. And so, or that are that people hold dear and help create the vibe that people love about Salt Lake City. Those businesses are starting to be forced out, not just by the change in the commercial environment, but also by the demand for housing, and they're being replaced by that. And so in order to help address some of those impacts, we need to think differently than we have in the past as a city and as a community. And if we want to have a diverse city and we want to be an affordable city, we need housing that aligns with that.
There's another question. What else is the city doing to help with affordability issues facing the city?
So there's a lot of different things that the city is doing. The city has increased over the last several years the amount of money that they are putting into affordable units, entering into public-private partnerships to help build more affordable units. But we're also looking at those other expenses, those day-to-day expenses as well, such as improving transit access, trying to lower transit costs, transportation costs. That's one of the reasons why we invest in increasing the transit access and the frequency of certain routes, why we are building an additional track station downtown, and why we're supporting various studies to improve access to transit in the city, where we're building more trails that cut through wider swaths of the city so people have more access. And so it's not just about housing, it's about other things as well. And when you look at those collectively, they all help make the city more accessible to more people. And by being more accessible, or accessibility means and includes a certain level of affordability. So we don't want to be a city that's only for people with high incomes. We recognize that all of our businesses, our schools, et cetera, all need various, the working class, and we need more families to help support our schools as they face declining enrollment. And a big piece of both of those are how much it costs to live and pay for housing in Salt Lake City.
So there's a similar kind of question that kind of builds on what we were just discussing. Planning seems to be moving forward with designing cities that are livable and walkable. Do they work with transportation and engineering on ways to gear the city toward that goal, not just for cars?
Yeah, we do. We coordinate almost everything we do in the planning division is coordinated with other city departments to make sure that there's the utility services available, that the water and the sewer and the storm drain are all compatible and sufficient to accommodate those growths. Public Utilities does a really good job of planning for the future based off of our general plans and our community plans that we have adopted as a city. And so as those things change and as we're growing, they alter those plans and to help identify what those needs are and some of the identify the shortcomings that we may have and how we can address them given our other constraints.
So there's another question from Jesse. Could you address how this would affect SR zones and their existing scale and character? And I think that SR zones have generally allowed for single family, some two family, maybe previously in the past, some kind of smaller apartment buildings or multifamily buildings. And generally what's proposed with this is to permit development that would be compatible with that existing scale and that existing character that are in those zones. There's a few modifications that could be allowed for lot width or for building coverage. And especially in these zones where a lot of the development occurred much earlier, I think that those modifications would also be consistent and aligned with their existing scale and character. There's another question from Jack. Do you feel family-friendly units are sufficiently incentivized in the proposed draft overlay language? My initial reaction is that incentives for 2+ bedroom units seem minimal and less likely to be acted upon than the 1-bedroom or studio unit incentives. Just to kind of start addressing this, Nick, I don't know if you want to add to it, is there is one limited incentive that would apply to 2-bedroom plus units. The others could apply to any type of unit, whether it's 2 bedrooms or more, or if it's a studio or a 1-bedroom. I think what we're trying to do is not put in too many requirements that would apply to different types of units. Amending the zoning ordinance, it can take a while, as we've already seen with this project. And what might be needed today with 2-bedroom or more units, or whether it is 1-bedroom or studio units, that might change down the road. And so we don't want to have it be too prescriptive in the zoning ordinance as to what kind of incentive you would be able to use to add these units.
Yeah, I would add too that some of the incentives, particularly in those zoning districts that are more low density, are intended to increase the housing type that is more accessible to and include more bedrooms. So it is a mix. And like Sara said, the more prescriptive something like this becomes, the less likely it is to be utilized. And there may be other tools that the city can use to help support and grow, particularly in our downtown area, the number of units that we may need to help support our schools and to help families stay in the city as their family sizes are changing.
Another question from Jesse. Are annual rent increases for projects seeking these incentives tied to AMI standards established by HUD? And yes, they're established to those AMI standards as far as whether it's 80% AMI, 60% AMI, or another level of AMI. One other question from Jesse, it's about SR3. Kind of a follow-up was also telling us what SR3 means. Also saying that I'm assuming that they're particularly interested in SR3. My understanding is that SR3 was created to maintain the unique character of these small bungalow and courtyard places. Won't there be an incentive to demo those homes and we could lose that unique character? And SR3 zones are often found kind of near, kind of just to the east of downtown or a little bit to the west in kind of those larger 10-acre blocks. And then there are the areas that are often in the center of those larger blocks where where those small courtyards and bungalows like he's talking about that were built in those. And SR3 is designed to retain those. And then in some areas it allows for greater development on the kind of the outer edges that front the major streets. And the proposal does limit incentives in those SR3 zones. I believe that it allows for a little bit of additional height, but it doesn't. It does limit. They are fairly limited for that SR3 zone based on kind of that intent of SR3 to begin with, as far as what's allowed in those areas. We had a question early on about the Thriving in Place study. and also about kind of just gentrification generally. I've had some questions about that. And the overlay is intended to provide affordable housing options in every neighborhood. We've talked a little bit about that already, and also help reduce displacement that's caused by gentrification. And there are other pieces that can help with this as well, such as an affordable housing loss mitigation program. The overlay by allowing incentives essentially says that this neighborhood is okay with more housing provided it is affordable, and more affordable housing units help to offset that displacement. And the housing mitigation program that addresses the loss of affordable units can also help even more. In addition, the overlay would not prevent market rate housing or limit what could otherwise be built. As far as where will residents park, generally the parking that would be required for the affordable units is the same number of spaces as required for other units. However, in the single family zones, if the unit is near high frequency transit, it does allow for no more than one parking space per unit. More than that wouldn't be required, but could be provided. There's a question from Robert. Is SLC making any plans to increase their capacity to enable them to monitor and enforce income restrictions on these developments?
Yeah, that's a big component to this proposal, is how does the city administer this program? And that's something that we'll be discussing as we go through this. Some of the things that we've been talking about on other zoning related proposals that have come from the Planning Commission are changing how our planning resources are allocated. And this is one of those things that we feel like our resources should be going towards. Also working with our partners in our department, particularly housing stability, to help track and address those types of issues that come up when you're administering a new program like this. Those are all things that we're going to figure out as we go through this process. And if we need to ask for additional resources as part of this adoption, then that's something that will flow through the budget process. But it absolutely is the ability to monitor and enforce regulations is a key component of this. And so we plan on doing those types of things. One thing that this will do is that those people who utilize these incentives will have some sort of reporting requirement where they're giving us access to their data so that we can ensure that they are following any agreed upon terms that either are required by the overlay or that come through any other approval process.
So there's a question from Megan. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but the question centers around single family zones where there would potentially be able to have up to a fourplex on the property. And so, for example, there's a zoning district called R17000, and lots in the R17000 zoning district generally are need to be a minimum of 7,000 square feet. And so in this particular neighborhood, the homes are about 2,200 square feet, and they're kind of asking questions about how a fourplex could potentially be built on this property. And so what would just trying to talk really generally about how this might work. So in this particular case, we would also have a lot coverage limit for the R17000 zone. Don't know off the top of my head what it is, but I think it would allow for probably about 30 to 40% lot coverage, which would be about 3,000 or 4,000 square feet. And so that could be, there would be a limit as to how much of that lot a home could take up. And so the intent behind allowing these larger, potentially allowing more units on the property is that they wouldn't be significantly larger than those existing homes that are on the street already. So instead of having maybe a single family home that has 2,200 square feet, you might have a fourplex that might be a little bit larger, but it would have 4 smaller units rather than one single family home.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that 7,000 square feet is the lot size, not the building size. So there's a big difference there.
And then there's a question about how many units we think this program can produce in the near future.
That's a good question, and it's really difficult to forecast that. The only thing that we really have to go on are those, how far the current dollars are going, and some of the issues and barriers that people have been building affordable units in the city have faced. For example, we've had some nonprofit developers tell us that they would have done more units if they had more building height, or if the lot coverage was, if they could get even 10% more lot coverage, they could have gotten an extra couple of units on a proposal. And so we don't know that number, primarily because it's almost impossible to guess. And so, like I was talking about earlier, one of the big components of an overlay like this is monitoring it to see how successful it is, and what kinds of issues are, and then being able as a city to adapt quickly if there are issues that were unforeseen, or if it's not producing the results that we'd hoped for. So we plan on being able to monitor these types of things as we move forward.
So there's a question from Valerie. Are these also LIHTC only developments? And so LIHTC is LIHTC, which is the low income housing tax credit. And then also wanting to know if the proposal would try to incentivize affordable housing without these federal funds. The low income housing tax credit is a federal program. And so first, this is not necessarily for LIHTC only developments. It's intended to be able to provide, apply to those if property owners wanted to go through the incentive and had the LIHTC fund and had LIHTC proposals, but it's not necessarily tied to those. And then a continuation from Valerie's question is also the certification process is already in place for LIHTC tenants. Could the city not copy and paste that for these developments? And I think there are aspects of the LIHTC program that if the property was already going through that could be applied to this proposal and this process as well, but it's not just limited to that program. And then Nick, if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, we don't want to, if somebody's already has some sort of a financial duty requirement to abide by various rules and reporting requirements, we want to be able to just capitalize off of that. There's no need to reinvent a process or to put an additional reporting process on anyone who may be utilizing these incentives if they're already doing that. So we absolutely want to honor and respect those other agreements and certification processes that may already exist that somebody may be subject to.
There's a question from Jesse. Will using the affordable overlay standards still allow for a developer to use the plan development process to seek relief from other zoning standards? And yes, you could combine those two together. One of the ideas with the overlay is also to simplify the process. And so the kind of the intent also could be that the plan development would no longer be necessary, but I think that it could still be applied if the overlay did not provide the relief that was needed in the standards as it is. One more question from Jesse. I'm curious why the 80% AMI is the threshold instead of more deeply affordable housing. I can start to answer that one. So I think the idea is to incentivize building a greater number of units, and that's kind of the initial starting point, is to encourage a greater number of units being built and to provide incentives for those units. And then it would be up to the developer or the property owner if they wanted to reserve those for a more deeply affordable threshold than that 80%. We have questions from like this that are saying, why is it only 80%? And then we've had some other questions saying, why isn't it greater than 80%? So really trying to kind of have a balance of the level of affordability.
Yeah, so maybe moving on to this next question from Tamara about one of our zoning districts called the FBUN2. This is a form-based zoning district that's mostly found in the Central Ninth neighborhood around the 900 South tracks stop. And this is kind of a separate issue than this, but it's definitely related to some of the impacts that density does have. And so we are looking at making some modifications to the FBUN2 zone as part of not just, it's not necessarily part of this project, but it's part of a greater downtown project where we're looking not only at building heights, but street design or street engagement standards to address some of those things. And then the city council is currently considering an update to the parking chapter. And I know that they have heard from people who live in and near that FBUN2 zone about the parking challenges. And so at this point, that's in their wheelhouse, and we're waiting for a decision on that to see what they do. I know that there was a parking study that was commissioned by our transportation division to look into those kinds of things, and I know that's going to be considered by the city council. I don't know what they're gonna do with that, but that's where that is right now.
So one very general question, how much are Salt Lake City and Utah growing?
Well, on a percentage of increase, Utah is one of the fastest growing states in the country, and that is mostly driven by our very low unemployment rate. And even though it is becoming more expensive to live, not just in Salt Lake, but in other areas along the Wasatch Front, we're still relatively, we're less expensive than many of those places where people are moving from to follow the jobs and things that we have here. So, and our job growth. So I don't know the exact number right now, but in Salt Lake City, one thing that I can tell you is that last year, the planning division approved over 6,000 new housing units scattered throughout the city. That's more than we probably have seen in any calendar year in our history as a city. And to put that into perspective, the post-World War II decade was when we saw the most housing units built in a decade, and that was about 12,000 housing units. So we're at a clip of producing about 3,000, building and opening about 3,000 housing units a year in Salt Lake City right now. And so if that continues, it only, that's the last few years, it's safe to say that we're probably in our largest period of growth ever as a city, which we're all experiencing what that means, both good and bad. And obviously our housing costs are directly tied to that. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to take some different steps than what we have in the past as a city, is that what we've been doing for the last 25 years hasn't been kept up with that growth demand, and that's increasing, putting a lot of pressure on our housing market. And so that's what we're doing, and that's why we're here.
Another question, where would the overlay apply? And one thing we've tried to do is to have it apply in a good part of the city where housing is permitted, which for the city as a whole isn't a particularly large percentage of the city. There's a lot of the city that's zoned M1 or that's zoned for open spaces or other uses, but it generally would apply in in all areas where residential uses are allowed. And then there's different proposals and different proposed regulations for those different residential zones. Another question is, do zoning requirements include any standards for green space? The 400 South corridor and downtown generally certainly lacks it. And
Yeah, do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's a couple of things there that are true. The 400 South corridor and the east down corridor is one of the areas of the city that has the lowest access to parks and open space. And while some developments are including some elements of that, there's other things that aren't being addressed. And so I think that there probably needs to be, not necessarily as part of this project, but some more livability standards added to a lot of our zoning districts, particularly those areas that are experiencing the most growth. I mean, this is a very similar question to what was asked about the FBUN2 in the Central 9th neighborhood. Is that, you know, it's one thing to get the density, but it's another to get that density so that it's an enjoyable place for people to live. And those are things that we need to be better about in our zoning code, for sure.
And we do have some elements that do include having some kind of private outdoor space, which is different than green space, but still kind of, I think, something that adds to the livability of a unit and the livability of an area. When you talk about transit corridors, does this just mean rail lines or does it mean any bus route in the city? And it's kind of somewhere in the middle of those. When we're talking about the parts of the proposal that apply to high frequency transit corridors, the proposal there would apply to the rail lines, including the S line. And then it would apply to bus routes that have or traditionally have 15-minute service during the peak periods. And so there are a number of those routes throughout the city, including a number of those funding our future routes that have started in the past few years. Another question from Kimberly, will the 40% only land use size apply now to ADU units, or would the standard still be allowing up to 50% land usage per lot for those? And so as far as these regulations, we're not changing any of the ADU requirements as part of this proposal. So the requirements that exist for ADUs right now wouldn't change. There may be some changes coming to those ADU requirements, but this would not affect those. Another question is, why are many new apartments so expensive? And the city and the zoning ordinance do not regulate the market prices, or kind of somewhat differently from this, the types of units that are constructed at, you know, if it's a 1-bedroom or a studio unit. This is up to the private market, and it has been shown that there is a demand for these units, and that has been what has been constructed. And, you know, as demand changes over time, that the unit type mix might change over time as well.
Yeah, and I would add that, you know, there's many things that influence the cost of a housing unit, particularly an apartment. And you know, there's a reality that when you have very low vacancy rates, meaning there's hardly any units available, those prices are going to go up to match. And one of the things that we are seeing is that's impacting not just new buildings, you know, but also existing buildings. And so that's starting to impact some of these older buildings where people will invest a minimal amount to, you know, update furnishings and things like that. And so that they can justify it, trying to get more rent because that's what the market's providing. And part of that is because this is not a unique situation to Salt Lake City. This is unique. This is a situation that applies to most cities, is that the rate of construction of new units is actually decreased over decades. in the United States. And so the number of new housing units built per capita of population is decreasing pretty significantly. And that's one of the reasons why not so many communities are seeing rapid increases in price. So there's some impact that zoning regulations have on that. Obviously, if you restrict the number of units that can be built, you're a desirable place to live, and people are moving in, and and their population is stable or increasing, you're going to see housing costs go up. And so that's a separate issue than what this affordable housing overlay is trying to do. But it's impacted by that for sure.
So it looks like we have time for one more question. There's a question from Jack. It seems like there's a real focus in the discussion on increasing the number of quote units generally. Is planning actively considering land use tools that are designed to specifically address the type of housing we aren't seeing the market build on its own, like deeply affordable or 2-bedroom or greater units? I'm concerned that a hyper focus on unit numbers creates different housing problems if we all see the market provide or encourage through policy our studio and 1-bedroom units.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a shared concern that the city has as well. Is it's one thing to grow units, but those units have to match our demographics and our need. And there's only so many studios or 1-bedrooms that a place like Salt Lake City is going to need. Right now, there's still that market demand for those, and that's why we're still seeing those built. But there are some other tools that the city could utilize to promote different types of housing. One thing, and I know that it's been highly controversial, but some of the zoning changes that are pending in front of the city council to the RMF zones are intended to increase the different types of housing. That's one of the reasons why over the years, we've started using more form-based codes that allow a variety of housing types. There's other things we can do by right now in most of our commercial zoning districts. Those other types of housing aren't allowed. And so while this project may address some of those things, there's some other zoning changes that really do need to happen for us to get that mix of housing type. And hopefully we'll be able to, as a city, be able to work on those sooner rather than later.
So we want to go ahead and thank all of you for watching. Please go onto our webpage. It will be posted in the chat below, and look over the proposal and provide us with comments. Let us know if you have any questions. You can do that through the comment form if you provide contact information, or you can contact me directly. My email is located on that project webpage as well. We will be seeking additional feedback and comments from the community and setting up meetings with other groups. Please let us know if you have additional questions or you'd like to have additional discussions, and we will reach out to you as things move forward.
Yeah, and Sarah, just so everybody knows, there will be another similar event like this in the coming months, where that event hopefully will focus more on some of the details and some of the changes that happen as we get more input on this. But it also will be part of when we advertise that, when we get that set up, we plan, hopefully we get a budget approved for this, but we plan on doing a mailer to every residential property in the city to let them know about the proposal, where they can go and find information. But that mailer will also include information about upcoming, at least the first planning commission public hearing, and any additional public engagement event that we work on. And I guess that's all we have. So I want to thank everybody for spending the time with us, and we look forward to continued conversations and more questions. Keep them coming, and more input on the proposal as you have an opportunity to start reading through it. And hope everybody has a good day.